The world didn't ask for your permission before it changed. And right now, while most Americans are busy watching cable news anchors argue about things that happened last week, the actual architecture of global power is being quietly redrawn in ways that will affect every single one of us. From the price of gas at the pump to whether your son or daughter gets deployed to some desert that Washington couldn't locate on a map 3 years ago. Russia, the country that American foreign policy has spent the last 4 years trying to isolate, sanction, humiliate, and render irrelevant, just did what the United States no longer can. It picked up the phone, made the calls, flew the diplomats, and positioned itself as the indispensable power broker between two nations that not long ago were firing missiles at each other's territory. Iran and Saudi Arabia, those ancient rivals who represent the Shia and Sunni poles of Middle Eastern power, are now speaking through Moscow and Washington. Washington found out the way it finds out about most things these days, after the fact scrambling to react, searching for a framework to explain something nobody in the State Department saw coming. That is what this video is about. Not the headlines, the truth underneath them. Let me walk you through exactly what has happened here, and why it matters far more than you've been told. On March 2, 2026, Vladimir Putin made 4 consecutive phone calls to the leaders of the Gulf, UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, Qatar's Emir Tamim, Bahrain's King Hamad, and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, positioning Russia as a mediator in the crisis that had erupted from US and Israeli strikes on Iran just days earlier. 4 calls in one afternoon, sequential, methodical. The Kremlin knew exactly what it was doing. This was not improvisation. This was a strategy that Russia has been building quietly and patiently for decades. Think about that for a moment. Russia, which by every mainstream Western narrative should be a crippled pariah, a broken economy staggering under sanctions, isolated on the world stage, that Russia just made itself the go-to phone number for every major power in the Middle East, and not one of those Gulf leaders hung up, not one of them told Putin to call Washington instead. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself acknowledged that Russia could play what he called a positive, stabilizing role, and that was because Moscow has cultivated ties with both Tehran and the Gulf capitals simultaneously. Let that sink in. The Saudis, who for decades have been the cornerstone of American strategy in the Arab world, are now openly welcoming Russia as a stabilizing force. This did not happen overnight. The seeds of this moment go back years. Washington has been slow to recognize that Saudi Arabia no longer sees itself as a security vassal of the United States, but rather as a regional power capable of playing an independent role in world politics. Riyadh's own officials have said the old arrangement, American security guarantees in exchange for low oil prices, is dead. Dead. That is the word a Saudi official used. Not renegotiated, not strained, dead. And the American foreign policy establishment spent years refusing to believe that sentence was real. The broader context here is essential because what you're watching unfold in 2026 is actually the culmination of a geopolitical shift that began years earlier. It was the United States that originally encouraged Iran and Saudi Arabia to begin reconciliation talks back in 2021, in an effort to reduce tensions and advance nuclear negotiations. Tehran and Riyadh held 5 rounds of direct talks under American facilitation. 5 rounds. And then what happened? Saudi Arabia turned to China instead, viewing President Xi Jinping as a better mediator, reasoning that Tehran would be unlikely to jeopardize its relationship with Beijing by violating any deal brokered there. America spent years creating the opening, and then someone else walked through the door. First China in 2023, now Russia in 2026. Washington keeps laying the groundwork and then getting locked out of the building it helped construct. In January 2025, Putin and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, a 20-year agreement covering defense, energy, counterterrorism, technology, cybersecurity, and peaceful nuclear cooperation. The Russian State Duma ratified it in April 2025, Putin signed it into law on April 21, and Iran's parliament completed ratification in May, a 20-year framework. This is not a handshake deal between leaders at a summit. This is a structural realignment written into law by both parliaments, governing the relationship between Moscow and Tehran for a generation. And it was ratified quietly while the Western press was busy with other things. The partnership is described by analysts as not merely a bilateral agreement, but a blueprint for a new emerging world order, inked at a time when 2 of the world's most sanctioned countries are trying to navigate geopolitical waters against what they perceive as pressure from a divided West. This framing is important because it tells you what Russia and Iran believe they are doing. They do not see themselves as simply surviving. They see themselves as building something new, an ecosystem, an alternative architecture, a world in which Washington's sanctions, Washington's disapproval, Washington's red lines, none of these carry the same weight they once did. Russia was chosen as Iran's first diplomatic destination after the 2026 war began, rather than China, for a specific reason. The Kremlin provides military technical capabilities that Beijing has historically been reluctant to fully extend, particularly in military space integration. Since late 2025, Moscow reportedly launched several Iranian satellites using Soyuz rockets, while Iran in exchange provided Russia with access to drone control algorithms and opportunities to test electronic warfare systems against Western-origin platforms in active Middle Eastern operational environments. Read that again slowly. Iran gives Russia real-world testing grounds for electronic warfare against American weapon systems. Russia gives Iran eyes in space. They are not just aligned geopolitically, they are integrated militarily and technologically in ways that have direct consequences for American power projection everywhere on Earth. Now let's talk about what happened on the ground in late April 2026, because this is where Russia's role as broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia becomes most vivid and most revealing. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrived in Russia on April 28 to meet with Putin directly, after a whirlwind diplomatic sprint through Pakistan and Oman. Araghchi briefed Putin on a diplomatic process aimed at fully ending the war and establishing peace and security in the Persian Gulf region, including the Strait of Hormuz. Think about the choreography here. Iran's top diplomat is not flying to Washington. He's not calling the State Department. He is going to Moscow. Because Moscow has what Washington does not have right now, credibility with all sides simultaneously. The Kremlin had repeatedly offered to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium, proposing to store or reprocess it on Russian soil, a proposal that could theoretically have resolved key US demands. But according to reports, President Trump rejected Putin's offer, presumably not wanting Moscow to gain even more leverage in nuclear energy. Trump turned down a Russian solution to the Iran nuclear problem because he didn't want Russia to benefit. The irony is devastating. In trying to deny Russia leverage, Washington denied itself an exit ramp from the conflict. Prior to the ceasefire currently in place, Iran had fired a daily barrage of missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other Gulf states during the war. Saudi Arabia at one point condemned Iran in the strongest terms, and yet despite all of that, Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia have since indicated a desire to pursue diplomacy over retaliation as long as Iran commits to not attacking them again. This is the remarkable thing. Even after being hit with Iranian missiles, the Gulf states turned toward dialogue rather than doubling down on confrontation. Why? Because they understand something that Washington's more bellicose voices still refuse to accept. A devastated Iran destabilizes the entire region in ways that hurt the Gulf monarchies far more than a negotiated peace does. Analysts have noted that Saudi Arabia wants close and independent ties with the United States, as well as with Russia and China. Riyadh sees itself as playing a crucial role in balancing Egypt, Iran, Israel, and Turkey to protect its own security and wield regional influence. To hold that position, it must nurture relations with all its neighbors. This is the new Saudi doctrine. Riyadh is not choosing Russia over America. It is refusing to choose at all. It is pursuing what you might call sovereign multipolarity, the idea that a powerful regional state does not have to align with a single patron, that it can deal with everyone, that it can pick up the phone to both the Kremlin and the White House on the same day. This is not a betrayal of Washington. It is a declaration of independence from Washington's framework. Russia's foreign ministry stated plainly that Moscow's initiatives, including its collective security concept for the Persian Gulf region, which was first proposed in the 1990s, allowed Saudi Arabia and Iran to previously restore relations. Russia framed its current mediation as a continuation of that long-standing project. This is critical for Americans to understand. Russia has been playing a patient, consistent game in this region for 30 years. While Washington swung between maximum pressure and diplomatic breakthroughs, between regime change ambitions and nuclear deal negotiations, Moscow kept one constant thread: the idea that Persian Gulf security must be collective, must include Iran, and must not be built on American dominance. And now, after 3 decades of patient advocacy, that framework is suddenly the most relevant one on the table. When Putin called Trump directly in late April to discuss the Iran ceasefire, the Kremlin spokesperson described the call as frank and businesslike. Putin told Trump that extending the ceasefire was correct and that it should provide an opportunity for negotiations. But Putin also warned of what he called the inevitable, extremely dire consequences for the entire international community if the US and Israel resorted to force again. There is something almost surreal about this exchange. Putin is now the voice of measured caution in a conversation with an American president about whether to restart bombing a country. That is a geopolitical inversion of enormous proportions. And it did not happen because Putin is wise or virtuous. It happened because Russia, for all its flaws, has maintained coherent strategic relationships across the Middle East in a way that Washington, swinging from crisis to crisis, from administration to administration, has simply failed to do. Analysts at the Washington Institute noted that Russia would seek to capitalize on America's latest entanglement in the region, luring US partners in the Gulf to its side with offers of mediating between them and Iran. They warned the Trump administration to focus on addressing the needs of Gulf states and including them in discussions over Iran's future. This is the foreign policy establishment beginning to notice the problem. But notice the framing. The advice is still reactive, still about catching up, still about trying to reassert influence after the ground has already shifted. The strategic initiative has passed. And here is the thing that nobody in Washington wants to say plainly. Former State Department Middle East advisor Aaron David Miller called Beijing's 2023 brokering of the Iran-Saudi deal stunning, saying it demonstrated that US influence and credibility in the region had diminished and that a new international regional alignment was taking place, empowering both Russia and China with newfound influence and status. That was 2023. This is 2026. The trajectory has not reversed. It has accelerated. The countries that Washington told you were isolated, Russia, Iran, are now the countries that every regional power is calling first. And the country that spent trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives buying influence in the Middle East is finding that influence erodes faster than it was built. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, its massive program for economic diversification away from oil, requires enormous levels of investment across tourism, logistics, entertainment, ports, and defense. When Iran and Saudi Arabia had no diplomatic ties, economic relations between them were basically non-existent. But just 5 weeks after the restoration of ties, Iranian trade officials were already expressing optimism about bilateral trade reaching $1 billion in the short term. Economics. That is what is really driving this. The Gulf states are not sentimental about geopolitics. They are trying to create conditions in which Vision 2030 can succeed, in which investment flows, in which the region does not explode every few years and scare away the capital they need. Russia understood this. Russia understood that the Gulf monarchy's deepest interest is stability, and offered itself as a vehicle for that stability. Washington, by contrast, spent 2026 bombing one of the region's major powers and then acting surprised when nobody wanted to join the coalition. Russia provided Iran with intelligence support during the 2026 war, including data on US military positions, in ways that analysts described as enabling Iran to sustain its defenses. Despite public condemnations of the strikes, Russia neither committed troops nor engaged in combat operations. It abstained from a UN Security Council resolution condemning Iranian attacks on Gulf states. This is Russia threading an extraordinarily fine needle, supporting Iran enough to preserve the relationship and demonstrate loyalty, not supporting Iran so much as to burn bridges with the Gulf states or risk direct confrontation with the United States, maintaining credibility as a mediator precisely by not being too close to any one side. It is sophisticated, disciplined diplomacy, and it is the exact quality that American foreign policy has consistently lacked in this region for 2 decades. Flights between Tehran and Moscow resumed in late April after a 2-month suspension caused by the war. The announcement came a day after Iran's foreign minister Araghchi met Putin to discuss the details of the conflict and the path forward. Civilian flights, the most ordinary of signals, but symbolic of the fact that whatever pressure the United States applied in this war, it did not sever the Moscow-Tehran connection. That link held. It is holding still. What does all of this mean for you, sitting here in the United States, watching these events unfold? It means that the architecture of global order that your government has been defending and administering since 1945 is undergoing its most serious structural challenge since the Cold War ended. It means that the dollar's role in oil markets, the reliability of American security guarantees, the assumption that Washington gets to set the rules, all of these are being tested simultaneously. And they are being tested not by military force primarily, but by something far more durable. The patient construction of alternative relationships, alternative frameworks, alternative trust. Russia did not broker peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia by threatening anyone. It did not drop bombs or impose sanctions or threaten regime change. It made phone calls. It hosted foreign ministers. It said consistently over decades that collective security in the Gulf was possible if all parties were included, including Iran, which Washington has spent 40 years trying to exclude, and slowly, one deal at a time, one relationship at a time, that approach is proving itself out, while the American approach proves itself exhausted. Russia's main focus when positioning itself in the Middle East is also significantly about Ukraine. Putin likely hopes that successive crises in the Middle East will continue distracting the United States from applying pressure on him over the war in Ukraine. The war's potential setbacks for Moscow's Middle East position may be outweighed by the opportunities the crisis creates. Russia is playing a multi-board game simultaneously. Every American distraction in the Middle East is Russian breathing room in Europe. Every American dollar spent on Gulf deployments is a dollar not supporting Ukraine. Every American diplomatic failure in Tehran is a Russian diplomatic advertisement. Washington is playing checkers, Moscow is playing chess, and the board is getting larger. This is the story nobody is telling you cleanly, not because the information isn't there. It is all there, hiding in plain sight across agency reports, think tank analyses, diplomatic readouts, and newswire dispatches. But because telling this story cleanly requires acknowledging something deeply uncomfortable, that American foreign policy, for all its resources and reach, has managed to spend 2 decades in the Middle East and emerge with less influence than it entered. That the countries it tried to isolate are now the indispensable mediators. That the framework it tried to impose is now the framework being discarded. The world didn't announce this change, it just quietly rerouted around Washington. And now,